My son, Nick, was a cross-country runner. He's pretty good in high school. But when he started out early, I don't know if you've ever been to a cross-country race. But they're really, really interesting. So you take 130, 140 kids and you spread them out across this field, right? And they're all lined up this way, but they're going to be going this way. And they're going to run 3.1 miles, 5 kilometers. And so what do? They all take off, and it's about 100 to 200 yard race to get to this little bitty path. And then they're all like a single file after that, kind of, right? And so what do you got to do? You don't want to be the last person to get to the trail, right? And so Nick, it was early on, freshman or sophomore year, he comes up to me and goes, "Dad, I got a plan." He goes, "I keep getting all lost in the trash, if you will. I get lost in all these other runners. So I'm going to be the first one to the trail." I go, "That's a good plan. I hope you make it," right? My son ran the best 200-meter dash you've ever seen. He beat everybody. I mean, by a long ways. I'm like, this guy's on fire. And about mile 1.5, 2 miles, people start passing him. He starts dropping back. Why? Because he had wasted all of his energy on this one part of the race, and he wasn't there to finish strong. And so what happened later on, he began to get better at learning how to not be the last person, but you didn't have to be the first person because you could pass people on the trail. And so he got stronger and stronger as his career went on. And it happens so much. It happens so much to us in life. And I had somebody this morning in Norman, they came up and they said, "Man, I'm really excited to hear what happens to Paul." And I said, "He dies." I mean, spoiler alert, And I'm 59 years old, and I know some of you young people down here, when I was your age, there's no way that I even thought about the end. But it's coming. And the older I get, the more I think about it. And the questions I have for myself is, am I going to finish strong? Am I going to finish strong? For an entire year. For an entire year, I have stubbornly said the same thing to you. Because that's what the life of Paul was about. It was about mission. It was about call. If you go all the way back to a little over a year ago when we started this journey about the life of Paul, we began to talk about our mission. What's our mission? Our mission is to make disciples as we go. I hope you can say that. I hope you'll never forget that. I said it over and over again because repetition, hopefully it drills in, right? Our mission is to make disciples as we go, but each of us have a different call. Each of us have a different mission. Each of us have a different purpose. And in that purpose, we are supposed to go to the people and the places that God sends us to and reveal Jesus to them in a way that makes them want to follow him. We've been talking about it stubbornly for a year. The question is, are we hearing that and willing to do it? Or are we going, yeah, that's great advice. I'm going to do something else. So how are you going to finish your life? Are you going to finish it strong? When we last left Paul, when we last left him, he was on his way to Jerusalem. It's the end of his third missionary journey. I don't have a map for you today, but he's on the third missionary journey. He's at the end, and he's heading back to Jerusalem. And all the way as he's heading back there, everyone's telling him, "Don't go, Paul. Don't go to Jerusalem. If you go to Jerusalem, you're going to be in chains." There was this prophet named Agabus who came and said, he took his belt and tied up his hands and feet and said, "This is what's going to happen to the person who owns this belt. You're going to be in trouble." Some of them were even saying, the Holy Spirit's telling you, don't go, don't go. And Paul says, I have to go. And so Paul's on his way to Jerusalem, and he gets there. And I'm going to show you today 3 ways that I think Paul finished strong. 3 ways that he finished strong, the ways that we can finish strong. 2 of them are in our narrative. 1 of them comes from his letters. The first way I think Paul finished strong was this. He was determined. He had a determination to his purpose. He was determined to stay on purpose, that mission we talked about. Look at chapter 21, verses 17 to 20. It says this: when we reached Jerusalem, Luke is writing this, so he's part of the group that went there. When we reached Jerusalem, the brothers and sisters welcomed us warmly. The following day, Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present. Who is James and the elders? We talked about this back in chapter 15. James and the elders were over the church in Jerusalem. The Christian church in Jerusalem was the main church of this Christian movement that was going on. Verse 19. After greeting them, Paul, reported in detail what God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. And when they heard it, they glorified God, and they said, "You see, brother, how many thousands of Jews there are who have believed, and they are zealous for the law." Now, what's going on here? Paul's reporting his ministry. His ministry had been successful. Now, he's talking about the Gentiles. They're also talking about the Jews. Paul himself called himself the minister to the Gentiles. In fact, later on when he's making his defense before that we're going to talk about here in a minute, he actually says, God told me I'm sending you out to the Gentiles. In Romans 15:16, he says that he's a minister of Christ to the Gentiles. In Romans 11:13, he says, I'm an apostle to the Gentiles. In Galatians 1:15 and 16, he says that God called me by his grace and he was pleased to reveal his son in me so that I could preach him among the Gentiles. Now, everywhere Paul went, he would always start in the Jewish synagogue, so the Jews still mattered to him. But Paul was determined to fulfill his purpose. Who is it that God has sent you to? Where do you go to school? Where do you work? Who's in your home? Who do you run into at Walmart? Who has God sent you to? Are you as determined as Paul to stay strong and determined to make sure that you're sharing the gospel with these people? You go on through chapter 21 and they begin to tell him, this is great, we're celebrating with you, but you need to know that there's some Jews, they've come. Verse 27 tells us they came from Asia. What was Asia? Asia was that region just to the north and west of Israel. And it was the first missionary journey, Paul went there to the Galatian churches. The third missionary journey, second he went through there, but the third missionary journey, Paul spent time on the western part of Asia, which is Ephesus and Colossae and some of those other places. And so he was in Asia, and these Jews are chasing him around. Why? To stop what he's doing. And they show up all the way in Jerusalem, and they've already come to Jerusalem, and these James and the elders say, they're stirring everybody up, and they're telling them that you don't care about, you've abandoned Moses. You've given up on the law. You're telling people not to circumcise their children. You're not following Jewish law. And so that began the basis of their accusation that led to his imprisonment, that ultimately then would end his life. So they're telling him, you need to appease them a little bit. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't want to appease them. I wish Paul would go, nope, not going to do it. They said, you need to take 4 other guys, you need to take a purification vow, this is a Jewish ritual, and you need to show them that you do care about the Jewish law. Paul's a better man than me. I would have said, nope. Look what he says, verse 26 of chapter 21. So the next day, Paul took the men, having purified himself along with him. He entered the temple, announcing the completion of the purification days, when the offering could be made for each of them. You see, Paul was so dedicated and so determined to the purpose that God had given him that he was willing to do something that your human nature would say you don't want to do. Why? He says it in 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, he says, I have become all things to all people so that I might reach some. Are you so determined to the purpose that God has given you that you're willing to give up what you really want to do to make sure someone else sees who Jesus is? Now, it's easy when that person is your family. When you're looking at your kids and you're hoping and praying to God that they come to Him. It's easy for you to look at that and say, yes, I'm determined. I'll do whatever it takes. But how many times are we in these moments where it starts getting hard and God has sent us to someone who needs to see Jesus in us, and we spend so much time defending our position, or we spend so much time worrying more about what we look like. And Paul's like, no, if they think this, let me show them. I'm willing to go through this purification vow to show them that. Sadly, it didn't work. But finishing strong means that you're determined to purpose the call that God has on your life, just like Paul was. I already said it, but I've been stubborn in my relentless proclamation that we have a mission. We all have one mission. I already said what it is. Make disciples as you go. But how many times, especially kids, when your parents tell you something, you're like, yeah, that's good. I probably should do that, but I don't want to. See, I think in the church, we've been hearing, since the time you came to know Jesus, you've known that we're supposed to make disciples, right? Right? And why aren't we doing it? Why aren't we doing it? We've spent generations lazily ignoring disciple making. Why? Because it's hard, yes. Because they're going to have opposition, yes. I don't know the last time someone came from miles around to make sure they tried to kill me to make sure I stopped making disciples. Paul was determined. I don't face anything like what he faces. Are you determined enough to make disciples, to engage the people in places that God sends you to? So that's the first thing. In finishing strong, you got to have a determination to the purpose that God has for you. Guys, as we close up the life of Paul, please don't miss this. You have a mission and you have a call and you need to stick to it. The kingdom depends on it. But the next thing we see that Paul finished strong. He finished strong in his defense of the faith, in his defense of Jesus. He was always preaching the gospel, no matter what. Now, buckle up, because we're about to go from chapter 21 to 26, all right? So we're going to hit this as highlights. I'm going to give you a timeline, and I'm going to talk a little bit. I got to talk faster than I did in Norman, so here we go. All right, so we're going to cover this ground, his defense of the faith. The first thing that happened after all of this, Paul made this purification. He showed them this. They didn't buy it. They turned on him, and this mob happened. There was a mob and a riot, and they tried to kill Paul. In fact, they pulled him aside, and they began to beat him. They began to beat him, and they're beating him, and this brings us to the next part, which is the Roman soldiers intervened. So they're over here beating Paul because they don't like what he's doing. They don't like how it's threatening what they're doing. And these Roman soldiers showed up, and they stopped beating him. Why? Because they didn't have any authority to beat him. They just did it because they could get away with it until Rome showed up. So the Roman soldiers intervened. Chapter 21, verse 33 says this. Then the commander approached, and he took him into custody, and he ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. There's the fulfillment of prophecy. He asked who he was and what he had done. They had accused him, by the way, of taking a Greek into the temple and some other things that broke the Jewish law. Verse 34, some of the crowd were shouting one thing and some another. And since he was not able to get reliable information because of the uproar, he ordered him to be taken into the barracks. And when Paul got to the steps, he had to be carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the crowd. This is a religious crowd. For the mass of people followed, yelling, "Get rid of him." So Roman soldiers intervene, and the next thing that happens is Paul makes his defense before the crowd. But I want you to notice his defense. His defense is not him just talking about trying to defend himself. He does a little bit, but he spends a lot more time doing something else. Look at verses 40. Start with verse 40. Paul stood on the steps and he motioned with his hand to the people. When there was a great hush, he addressed them in Aramaic. Brilliant move, by the way. This was the common language of the people. Brothers and fathers, listen now to my defense before you. When they heard that he was addressing them in Aramaic, they became even quieter. He continued, I am a Jew born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city, educated at the feet of Gamaliel. They would have known who that was. According to the strictness of our ancestral law. He's drawing them in. He's telling them, guys, I'm a Jew. I'm just like you. I didn't mean for that to rhyme. Sorry. Verse 4. I persecuted this way. The way was the name that was used to describe this movement of Christians. I persecuted this way to the death, arresting and putting both men and women in jail. Can I tell you something? I believe that these Jews would have known who Paul was before he became a Christian. They would have known he was the guy that was on their side killing these other Christians. And I think they were more concerned. They were concerned about what he was doing to their way of life. But they probably, do you ever have somebody that's on your team and then they decide to be on the other team? And you don't like it very much? They're worked up because now he's on the other team and they don't like it. Verse 5, as both the high priest and the whole council of elders can testify about me. After I received letters from them to the brothers, I traveled to Damascus to arrest those who were there and bring them to Jerusalem to be punished. After he says, I'm one of you guys. I used to be just like you, but I found Jesus. He goes on to tell his story. If you were with us at the very beginning of the life of Paul, we went into Acts chapter 9, and we see the story of what happened. But basically what happened was Paul was on his way to Damascus with a letter from the high priest to be able to arrest and persecute Christians who were following Jesus. And on his way there, this light from heaven came and blinded him, took him to his knees. And then he heard a voice. The voice, he said, who is it? And the voice said, I'm Jesus, the one you're persecuting. Paul met Jesus on the road to Damascus, and he's sharing this with these people. And he says, and he told me then to go to Damascus. When I got there, this guy named Ananias showed up. The Holy Spirit told Ananias to go to Paul. And he went there. He laid his hands on him. The scales fell from his eyes, and now he could see. And then Jesus told him, I'm sending you to be my example. I'm giving you your call. I'm giving you your purpose. Your purpose is to go and tell the Gentiles about me. So he told them all about that. And then he goes on to tell them that this Jesus that I met, you guys think I'm against Judaism? Jesus actually lines up with everything, the law of Moses and the prophets and the history of Israel. They all point to him, and he fulfills all those prophecies about the Messiah. And so he's telling them all about that. But then here's where, as smart as he was to use Aramaic, then he changes, and he does something I think wasn't very smart, but that's okay. I'm not Paul. He goes on and he says, but then Jesus told me to get out of Jerusalem because you guys are going to reject me. And then this is where he really got him. He said, and he told me to go out there. He's sending me out to the Gentiles. Oh, that was it. It was the last straw. Verse 22. They listened to him up to this point. And then they raised their voices shouting, listen to this, religious people, wipe this man off the face of the earth. He should not be allowed to live. They continued on, and the Romans didn't know what to do with him because this riot's breaking out. They're yelling. They want him killed. So they go, well, let's interrogate him. Interrogate in Roman means let's get the scourge. Let's get the cat of nine tails. Let's go whip him. And so they lay Paul out, and they're about to whip him with this leather whip that's got bones and glass and pottery all in it. And they're about to whip him. And Paul looks up and goes, hey, is it okay for you to whip a Roman citizen? And they back up. Like, wait, you're a Roman citizen? Yep. See, what you need to know about Paul is Paul had one parent that was Jew, and he had another parent that was Roman, and he was a Roman citizen born into Roman citizenship. And the commander goes, I shouldn't even have him tied up. So he reveals his Roman citizenship, and so the commander unties him and sends him to the Sanhedrin. And he goes there and makes a defense before the Sanhedrin. Now, what's the Sanhedrin? Real quickly, it's this. It's 71 people. The high priest, the chief priest, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the scribes, the experts in Jewish law. Who were they? They were a judicial body, but they could only make laws and rule on things that had to do with Judaism. They had no authority to execute anyone. They had no authority in the Roman world, but they thought they were something. You remember Jesus stood before this same body of people, right? And so he gets sent there, and he makes this his case before them. He's bold, but he's respectful. He tries to relate to them as a former Pharisee. He realizes he's getting nowhere, and he does something. I don't know if this is brilliant or not, okay? But in the middle, he realizes he's getting nowhere with the Sanhedrin, and so what's he say? He splits the room down the middle. He goes, well, I'm on trial because of the resurrection of the dead. Well, why is that split the room down the middle? Because Sadducees didn't believe in resurrection. They didn't believe in a spirit at all, that everything was matter to them. The Pharisees did, which Paul was one. In fact, that room started arguing. Some of the Pharisees started saying, well, maybe he did hear from God. So he split the room down the middle. He causes this big uproar again. Again, I don't know if that was good or not. But anyway, so then what happens? They put him away. He's under house arrest. Several days are passing by here, by the way. And he's under house arrest. So these 40 Jews decide we're going to kill him. So there was this plot to kill him. These 40 Jews, they're going to wait along the road, and they're going to kill him when he's being moved. And they went to the Sanhedrin. They say, we will not eat or drink until Paul is dead. These are committed to their cause, more committed than us sometimes. They're going to kill him. And so Paul's nephew goes to the commander and says, hey, you need to protect him. You need to protect him because he's going to be killed. And he tells him about the plot. So this commander gets this army of people, these soldiers, about 400 at least. And he says, we're going to move him now to Caesarea at night. And so he takes him to Caesarea so that he can be seen and stand before Felix. And he makes his defense before Felix in Caesarea. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Caesarea. Caesarea was a port city, and this city was developed by a guy named Herod the Great. You've probably heard of him. Herod the Great was the Herod, or the king, the Jewish king in charge when Jesus was born. He's the one, Christmas story here, by the way, he's the one who had all of the babies killed to try to kill Jesus. Okay? And so this is the guy, that Herod the Great. And he built the port of Caesarea somewhere between 22 and 10 BC. To honor Caesar Augustus, another part of the Christmas story, right? The census was declared by Caesar Augustus. To honor him and name the city after him, Caesarea, and to honor Rome. So here he is. He is the one who creates the Caesarea. And Felix is put in 52 AD. Felix is put in charge by Claudius, who is the emperor at the time. Nero eventually would become the emperor, but Caesar, the emperor at the time, the Caesar, his name is Claudius. He puts Felix in charge of Judea and Syria, okay? And so he's in charge of Jerusalem. He's in charge of putting things in place, of governing for Rome, of collecting taxes. He was a decent governor. If you've paid attention all this time through the life of Paul, Rome had taken over all this land, and they had all these provinces or states, if you will. They had all these states, and they would send governors that were puppets for Rome, and they would be in charge. Somewhere along the way, Felix did some things. There were some irregularities in his governing, and he was returned. So Paul is standing before Felix. He's sent there to Felix. Really what they're doing is they're moving it up the chain to send him to the emperor who is in Rome. It just would be very expensive to send him over there. So they send him to Caesarea, and Paul makes his defense. And his defense is pretty simple. His defense is, I didn't stir things up. I'm loyal to Judaism, but you need to understand I'm also loyal to Christ and the resurrection. Do you notice what he keeps saying in his defense? He says, I didn't do this. But he spends more time talking about who Jesus is, talking about his faith in him, talking about the gospel and the resurrection and what Jesus did. And that is how you finish strong. You finish strong by continuing to bring up the gospel, continuing to tell the story of Jesus. If you don't know what to tell people when you're standing in front of them and they're the people God has sent you to, you start with Jesus. You probably end with Jesus. Somewhere in the middle, you might bring yourself up, but for the most part, you are talking about Jesus. That's what Paul did. He continued to make his defense before them. Felix's reaction was, he did have some interest in the resurrection, but he delayed. He put Paul in prison for 2 years. Paul gets thrown in prison. Now, it's not a dungeon type prison. He's kind of in a house, like house arrest. Friends can come and take care of his needs. He's pretty much taken care of, but he's under guard, but he had freedom. But Felix would keep bringing him back to talk to him. Why? Because he was interested in what he was saying, but really what he wanted him to do was he wanted him to bribe him. He wanted him to bribe him so that he could get out, but he kept him in prison as a favor to the Jews. And in the middle of all this, then there's this guy named Festus who succeeds Felix. So I told you, Felix gets recalled as like bad governor, pull him back. They put this new guy, Festus, in charge. He shows up. Who's this guy, Paul? Why has he been in prison for 2 years? Well, the Jews have made all these accusations against him, but we really don't have any reason to hold him. And so Festus says, okay, do you want to go back to Jerusalem? Well, he didn't want to do that because the Jews were already plotting if he was on his way back to Jerusalem to kill him. And so he goes, no, I'm on trial before Caesar. I appeal to Caesar. In other words, take me to Rome. Pretty smart, but it kept him in prison for quite a while. And then he makes his defense before Herod Agrippa, who shows up next. Herod Agrippa, you had Herod the Great. His grandson was Herod the First. Herod the Second is this guy, Herod Agrippa the Second. This is the king that's in charge at this point. He is in charge. This is crazy. He's a king. He's a Jewish king, but he actually can appoint the high priest. It's so corrupt. I mean, when you think about it, you got a government that's telling the church who to be in charge, right? And so he's the last Herodian king. There is no more Herods after Agrippa II. But Paul makes his defense in front of him. Again, he tells his story. Paul is always coming back to his story. He's always coming back to his story about who he was before he met Jesus, when he met Jesus, who he is now because of what Jesus has done. And guys, that's the key for us. The key for us is that if we are going to finish strong, we've got to know our story and we've got to be willing to share it. And yes, it's going to be hard, and you're going to have people push back against it. And you may think your story isn't that important, or you may think your story isn't that grandiose. When I was growing up, I never forget all the people that had that story, right, where they lived like the devil, and then Jesus got a hold of them, and now they're living for Jesus. And it's like, man, that's a great story. And what's your story, Nathan? Well, I grew up in the church. I mean, you feel like I don't have the story. No, you have a story. You have a story because we were all lost without Jesus. But when we met Jesus, he changed everything. And now every day, hopefully your story's not about what he did 2 years ago. It's about what he did yesterday. Hopefully you get to keep sharing and relating to people. Isn't it great? Have you ever been in that situation where God puts you in front of somebody? Maybe it's at Walmart. Maybe it's somebody you already know. And they start talking about something that you're dealing with, that God has already begun to work in your life with. And you start telling, well, this is what God did for me. And it's amazing how God does that. But finishing strong means that you're continuing to defend your faith, willing to tell your story no matter where you're at, in front of whatever people God puts you in front of. I'm going to ask Stephen to come back up as I get to the third and final thing that I think shows that Paul finished strong. And this is not in Acts, okay? We'll go back to Acts to finish up next week, chapters 27 and 28. But let me tell you, I see Paul finishing strong because of the attitude that he had no matter his circumstances. And you go to his letters and you begin to see what his attitude was. Now, I'm going to ask you a hard question. You don't have to answer out loud. You can nod your head. I don't care. Do you ever go through difficult times? You ever go through times where it just feels like, man, you just can't get any traction in your faith? Or things you're just struggling, right? You want to be who God wants you to be, but sin keeps knocking at the door, and you fall down and you feel like junk. You hate it. Or maybe you're just going through hard times, financial, relationships, whatever it is. And what's your attitude in those? Look at how Paul looked at those things. I'm going to go quickly. 2 Corinthians 12, 9 and 10. Therefore, I will most gladly boast all the more about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may reside in me. So I take pleasure in weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and in difficulties for the sake of Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong. He goes on in Romans 5 to say that suffering produces perseverance. It makes me stronger. In Colossians 1, he says that I rejoice in my sufferings. That's crazy, isn't it? In Romans 8, he says that the suffering that we have, that we go through today, doesn't compare to the eternal glory that we have in heaven. I love Philippians chapter 4. I won't read all of this, but what's he say there? Rejoice in the Lord always. That's an attitude that finishes strong. You can't finish strong because life's going to be hard and bad stuff's going to come. You can't finish strong if you don't have an attitude that says, I will rejoice no matter what comes. I will give faith. I will continue to defend Jesus no matter what I go through. He goes on in there to say that I've learned how to be content in every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, because I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. And then he ends probably close to his last words that were written down. He says, I fought the good fight, finished the race, kept the faith. I know I talk a lot about my family a lot. I talked about my dad a couple of weeks ago, and I talk about my Uncle Roy a lot, but I'm really proud of the legacy of my family. My Uncle Roy was a pastor. He was an evangelist. He was a campus pastor at Missouri University for 50 years. Led so many people to Christ, led college students to Christ, and they went out all over the place telling people about Christ. Wherever he went, he shared the gospel. Every person God put in front of him, whether it was in an elevator, whether it was at a toll booth, whether it was at Walmart, no matter where he was, someone was in front of him, and he saw that as an opportunity to share the gospel of Jesus Christ with them. And because of that, I've shared this with some of you before, he baptized over 9,000 people in his life. Crazy to think about. 9,000 people. He preached revivals, and he preached in all 50 states, and he preached in 6 continents. The only one he didn't make it to was Antarctica. I'm not sure how many churches there are there anyway. But I'll never forget at his funeral, his sons talking about his life. And there were 2 things that popped up. See, the end of his life, last 7 years of his life, he fought throat cancer, and he had a growth on his neck that was almost as big as his head. It was huge. And he suffered, but he kept preaching the gospel. But they talked about his life, and they said 2 things that jump out to me. One of them was this: my dad didn't have any hobbies. The church was his hobby. Telling people about Jesus was his hobby. But here's the thing that jumped out to me more than anything I ever heard anybody say about a person, especially Uncle Roy. They asked him, Dad is on his deathbed, days before he died. Dad, what was the hardest thing about ministry for you? He said, telling people about Jesus. I'm like, no, that can't be right. You were the most successful person I know, maybe outside of Billy Graham, at sharing Jesus and leading people to Jesus. How could you say it was hard? Because it's hard. And if you want to finish strong, it's not going to be easy. We have a mission, and you have a call. And you can walk out today and say, that's awesome, that's great, we need to do it, and get in your car and do something else. Or you can say, I'm going to draw a line in the sand today, and I'm going to finish strong. No matter how many years you have left, and the places God sends you to, the people he sends you to, finish strong by sharing the gospel, no matter what. Guys, we get a chance to respond to this. I pray all over this room, people are saying, yes, that's me, I draw a line in the sand. There's prayer team members up here. We got communion on the sides as well. You come and pray. I don't know what your response is, but guys, no matter what it is you're focused on, there's nothing more important than letting people know who Jesus is. So as we stand and worship, will you draw that line in the sand and say, that's me? Let's stand, let's worship him.